Hello. Today I am going to be covering a topic that I have been brooding about for a pretty long time. If you go onto Booktube or really any other form of literary social media, you will quickly stumble across a multitude of explainer videos, especially when it comes to the fantasy genre. And I'm sure you've seen plenty of these. You know, the videos that are like, Grimdark Fantasy Explained, Portal Fantasy Explained, or who could forget the all-popular and ever-enduring every fantasy subgenre explained. I think the creation of these videos can be a noble task. By providing a working definition in several examples of some niche subgenre, it encourages the people who watch the video to broaden their literary horizons and check out books that might not have been on their radar beforehand. The problem is, most of these videos are terrible. And I know that sounds pretty harsh. I want to be clear that I am not dismissing anyone who is making these videos, but I am critiquing the trend in aggregate. And what I am critiquing is the fact that none of these videos that are supposedly providing universal definitions for all of these subgenres and terms agree on literally anything. This is especially apparent when it comes to delineating neighboring subgenres, such as high fantasy versus epic fantasy, or dark fantasy versus grimdark fantasy, or sword and sorcery versus heroic fantasy. Any video that you click on might give you a radically different explanation for the differences between these pairs. Some will say that these paired subgenres are synonymous. Others will say that these paired subgenres are different, but offer needlessly complex and Byzantine means to determine the differences between the two. So because every single one of these videos is offering alternative definitions for these common terms, these videos fail in their fundamental goal of getting everyone on the same definitional page. Instead, it spreads confusion and even misinformation. And there is no term that is more fraught, that is more challenging to nail down than the term low fantasy. In all of my years, I have literally seen dozens of different definitions for what low fantasy is, for what it entails. And the problem boils down to this. We all agree vaguely what high fantasy is. Or at the very least, we agree that The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is the platonic ideal of high fantasy. So that means the term low fantasy, whatever it means, must mean the opposite of The Lord of the Rings. But there's actually so many ways that a hypothetical fantasy work can be different from Lord of the Rings. The endlessly unresolved problem of low fantasy and what it means is exactly what has turned me against these subgenre explainer videos, because they are all claiming to speak from a place of authority. It's common to make vague gestures at a research process, like, I checked 3 times and this is what low fantasy means. Oh, I really did the research on this one and this is what low fantasy means. But if you really did the research, why does it feel like you just made up a definition on the spot? Or even worse, why does it feel like you are parroting a definition in examples that an artificial intelligence fed to you? I have seen a litany of examples where people will offer one definition of low fantasy, but then offer examples that do not even apply to the definition they provided, but do apply to a different definition of low fantasy. I want to be clear that it's okay to have your own unique definition of what low fantasy or any of these other subgenres are. But it is not okay to claim to be an expert, to speak from a position of authority, and then just make up bullshit or fucking regurgitate AI slop. I just want words to mean things. I want us to have shared definitions that we can all agree on, or at least recognize with nuances, so that we can have more productive conversations going forward. And to push back against the proliferation proliferation of AI misinformation, I have done a deep dive into the entire history of low fantasy as a term. What I am going to be doing is looking at the 4 most commonly held definitions of what low fantasy means. Then, in turn, I am going to problematize each and every one of them. I am going to point out why each of those definitions is flawed. I am hoping that in doing so, I will help you ruminate on these different subgenre definitions. What does it mean when we use these terms to describe the books that we read? I do not claim to have all the answers, or really any answers. This is just a Socratic dialogue, and hopefully it'll inspire somebody to one day nail down a much more efficient definition than the ones that we are working with right now. But without further ado, these are the 4 most commonly propagated definitions of low fantasy. The first is that high and low fantasy is synonymous with secondary versus primary world fantasy. So high fantasy takes place in some invented secondary world like Narnia or Westeros, while low fantasy is anything that is set on the primary world, aka Earth. So when people are using this definition, they'll say Harry Potter is low fantasy. The second possible definition is epic fantasy versus sword and sorcery. So under this definition, high fantasy means door stopper quest fantasy like Lord of the Rings or Wheel of Time, while gritty pulp fantasy like Conan the Barbarian or Elric of Melniboné or any other sword and sorcery counts as low fantasy. The third common definition is that low fantasy is synonymous with intrusive fantasy. This term is taken from Farah Mendelssohn's seminal 2008 work Rhetorics of Fantasy, where she separates the fantasy genre out into a taxonomy of 4 structures, intrusive fantasy being one of them. Intrusive fantasy refers to works where magical situations unexpectedly impede the real world. The most common example given in these explainer videos is Indian in the Cupboard. Under this view, high fantasy is synonymous with both immersive fantasy, which throws you into the deep end of a fantasy world, as well as portal fantasy, where you learn about and experience a fantasy world through a viewpoint character, such as the Pevensey children in the Chronicles of Narnia. The fourth and final common definition is, well, this one's actually more of a catch-all for all of the other definitions. Like, high fantasy is when there's high magic, and low fantasy is when there's low magic. High fantasy is when works are idealistic, while low fantasy refers to works that are gritty. High fantasy refers to works that are dumb and for babies, while low fantasy refers to fantasy that is enjoyed by cool grown-ups like myself. The reason why I am collating all of these together, they are all ultimately derived from the first principle that a Game of Thrones is low fantasy. That is being contrasted with the Lord of the Rings as the archetype of high fantasy. It should be noted that under all 3 of the other common definitions, Game of Thrones is high fantasy. So let's look at this first common definition of low fantasy. The idea that high fantasy is set in a secondary world, which people will always say means a invented setting completely unrelated to our own. That's important. The given examples will be something like Lord of the Rings, Wheel of Time, while low fantasy in this schema means something set on the primary world of Earth. I appreciate how clear-cut this definition is. It makes it really easy to litigate what is or is not high fantasy by the simple checklist of, does this take place on Earth or not? However, I have 2 problems with it. One is a minor problem and the other is a huge problem. The minor problem is, if high and low fantasy is synonymous with secondary world versus primary world fantasy, then literally what is the point of having the terms high and low fantasy? We can just say primary world fantasy or secondary world fantasy, and people do that. I am of the belief that if we are going to use distinct terms, then there's no point in having those terms be synonymous with other terms that are also in popular usage. But that might just be my opinion. Here is the real problem with defining high versus low fantasy as secondary versus primary world. Under this definition, Lord of the Rings Rings, the most common example people use to illustrate this divide, isn't even high fantasy by this definition. Lord of the Rings takes place on Earth. It is set in the far distant past of humanity, but Tolkien did intend for it to serve as a prehistoric mythology for who we are today. Tolkien even claimed that we in the modern day are currently living in the 7th age of Middle-earth. And once you realize that, you begin to notice that a lot of the other most cited high fantasy works are actually low fantasy using this definition. Lord of the Rings is in Earth's distant past. The Sword of Shannara, the most famous knockoff of Lord of the Rings, is set in Earth's distant future. The Wheel of Time, the most notable modern successor to the Lord of the Rings, is set maybe in the distant past or maybe in the distant future of Earth. Who knows, because the Wheel of Time keeps turning. So it would be one thing if people stuck to this original definition and said that Shannara, Wheel of Time, and Lord of the Rings count as primary world fantasy, but they don't. They say that they are completely invented lands, completely unrelated to our own. And because it is so common to call these worlds high fantasy, then it completely undermines this definition. It stops meaning anything. But perhaps for further elucidation, we can go back to the man himself. The terms primary and secondary world were popularized by J.R.R. Tolkien in his iconic 1947 essay on fairy stories. I have it reprinted here in my Ballantine of the Tolkien Reader. Wait, what's this? Hey ho, Merry-dill, ring-a-dong-a-dillo? It's Tom Bombadil, Tom Bombadillo! I think anyone who is even mildly interested in the fantasy genre should read On Fairy Stories, where Tolkien outlines his entire theory and mode of thought for how he approaches fantasy, both in terms of writing it and reading it. You don't have to agree with all of his opinions about fantasy. I mean, I disagree with many of the claims that he asserts, but I think it will help you become a deeper and more informed reader of fantasy. And it's not that long of a read either. Tolkien elucidates on the difference between a primary world and a secondary world in his section on children, where he dismantles the argument that children like fantasy more because they are gullible or otherwise easily fooled. This is what Tolkien has to say when it comes to how people listen to and receive imaginative stories. Children are capable, of course, of literary belief when the story maker's art is good enough to produce it. That state of mind has been called willing suspension of disbelief. But this does not seem to me a good description of what happens. What really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from the outside. So as you can see, Tolkien actually has a completely different notion of what primary and secondary worlds mean. Yes, the primary world is our world, but the secondary world is the world that the storyteller creates. The secondary world doesn't exist completely outside of the realms of Earth. The secondary world is the story as envisioned within the imaginations of the writer of the tale and the reader of the tale. So using Tolkien's own definition, every single fantasy novel is by default a secondary world. This leads to the meat of Tolkien's essay where he talks about how to make a secondary world successful. And what it boils down to is a massive defense of world building. You can do or say anything in a fantasy story, but that does not necessarily mean that the reader will believe it. Thus, it is the author's job to create a world that is so fully realized in terms of its language and politics and peoples and so forth, that even the most fantastic of things can be imagined by the reader as true. The example that Tolkien likes to give is the concept of a green sun. To an average human, the idea of the sun being green is absolutely impossible. But, as Tolkien argues, if you were to create a holistic world of complete narrative magnificence, then someone might believe that a green sun is real. That's right, Tolkien said Homestuck is the pinnacle of literature. Let me put it in his own words. Fantasy has also an essential drawback. It is difficult to achieve. Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more subcreative. But at any rate, it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce, and more unlike are the images and the rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. It is easier to produce this kind of reality with more sober material. Fantasy, thus, too often, remains undeveloped. It is and has been used frivolously, or only half seriously, or merely for decoration. It remains merely fanciful. Anyone inheriting the fantastic device of human language can say, the green sun. Many can then imagine or picture it, but that is not enough. Though it may already be a more potent thing than many a thumbnail sketch or transcript of life that receives literary praise. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempt such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art. Indeed, narrative art, story making in its primary and most potent mode. Under Tolkien's worldview, it's not just preferable for a fantasy author to put in the effort to craft a living, breathing secondary world, it is their duty to do so. To Tolkien, the creation of fantasy is a religious action. Let me explain. According to Tolkien's Catholic beliefs, only God has the ability to create ex nihilo, which is to say, only God can create matter out of nothing, to produce molecules and atoms when there was formerly nothing there. However, because mankind is created in God's image, human beings still have the same creative impulse. And so, when human beings are creative, when they engage in art, in story, in craftsmanship, they are channeling a small fraction of God's might. They are creating a small window of love and beauty by which human beings can understand the deeper mysteries of the universe. Tolkien called this process sub-creation. You can see this in The Lord of the Rings, which Tolkien used to explore Christian themes of goodness and mercy, but in a very general, not pushing it in your face sort of way. He was always frustrated with Lewis's books for being too literal in their allegory, for shoving the Christianity right in your face. So as such, even if you don't subscribe to Tolkien's beliefs, I think the general takeaway is that all fantasy is ultimately a reflection of our lived reality. It's not completely separate from our world because fantasy is written by human beings. And every fantasy novel ever written in one way or another reflects the primary world that we live in. Let me read you his own words from the epilogue of On Fairy Stories. Probably every writer making a secondary world, a fantasy, every sub-creator, wishes in some measure to be a real maker, or hopes that he is drawing on reality, hopes that the peculiar quality of this secondary world, if not all the details, are derived from reality, or are flowing into it. If he indeed achieves a quality that can fairly be described by the dictionary definition, inner consistency of reality, it is difficult to conceive how this can be if the work does not in some way partake of reality. The peculiar quality of the joy in successful fantasy can thus be explained as a sudden glimpse of the underlying reality or truth. Is it not only a consolation for the sorrow of this world, but a satisfaction and an answer to that question? Is it true? The answer to this question that I gave at first was, quite rightly, if you have built your little world well, yes. It is true in that world. That is enough for the artist, or the artist part of the artist. But in the eucatastrophe, we see in a brief vision that the answer may be greater. It may be a far-off gleam or echo of Evangelium in the real world. The use of this word gives a hint of my epilogue. It is a serious and dangerous matter. It is presumptuous of me to touch upon such a theme, but if by grace what I say has in any respect any validity, it is, of course, only one facet of a truth incalculably rich. Finite only because the capacity of man for whom this was done is finite. He goes on to say that any eucatastrophe in fantasy, which is the shocking, sudden climax of hope in goodness, as he demonstrated in The Lord of the Rings by the shocking yet inevitable destruction of the ring only through the mercy that had been given to Gollum earlier in the tale, is a reflection of what he believes to be the greatest eucatastrophe of all, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Anyway, we are done with the theology lesson for the video. The takeaway here is, under Tolkien's definition of primary versus secondary worlds, all fantasy is secondary, because there is literally no such thing as primary world fantasy, because we are living in it. God is the author of the primary world that we live in. Since, under this definition, there is no such thing as primary versus secondary world fantasy, thus we cannot define low fantasy versus high fantasy using it as a benchmark. On to definition number 2. The second common definition of low fantasy, and this is the one that I actually originally heard as a child, is that low fantasy is synonymous with sword and sorcery as typified by Conan the Barbarian, while high fantasy are the more lengthy, epic, save the world, yada yada tomes like Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings. I just want to say the definitions in this section are going to get very, very complicated. So I am going to quickly offer my own definition of pulp fantasy. What ultimately differentiates Conan the Barbarian and its successors from the Lord of the Rings and its successors is not Conan is about one rugged guy who goes on adventures and rescues maidens, while Lord of the Rings is about epic stakes and saving the world. No, none of that matters. What ultimately differentiates the two is how they were published. Conan the Barbarian and all of these other tales that would go on to be known as Sword and Sorcery, such as Jirel of Joiry and Elric of Melnibone and the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, were all published as installments of various pulp magazines throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. You would go to a newsstand and buy a magazine like Weird Tales or Astounding, flip open the pages, you would get a couple of short stories, you would get some novellas, and you would even get novels that are serialized over the course of a couple of months. Basically, all of the early and mid 20th century American fantasy that would come to be known as sword and sorcery. On the other hand, most of what eventually becomes called high or epic fantasy, like the works of William Morris, Lord Dunsany, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and so forth, are all written as novels, predominantly by British writers. So the fact that there are two completely different literary scenes for fantasy in the early 20th century that are separated by publishing format, by tone, and even by continent, seriously impacts early attempts to define what the fantasy genre even is. And what will make things even more complicated is that people from both of these camps are reading each other's work interchangeably and not considering themselves as being part of separate camps. All of that to say is, in order to keep my definitions a little clear, because some of these other definitions are going to get a little muddy, I am going to refer to the first camp as pulp fantasy, while I will refer to members of the second camp as novelistic fantasy. I also like the term pulp fantasy because it spreads a wider umbrella. Sword and sorcery is often taken to mean just Conan the Barbarian and its knockoffs, but in using the term pulp fantasy, I can also pull in the weird fiction of H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith, as well as the sword and planet fiction of Edgar Rice Burroughs and Lee Brackett. All of these interrelated subgenres were being written and published in the same magazines. After all of that prologue, let me take you to the year 1961. The fantasy fandom as we know it today is very young. Lord of the Rings is a couple of years old, but it hasn't yet evolved into a global phenomenon. So most fantasy fandom as as it existed at the time is actually collated around pulp fantasy, because that's what was coming out on a monthly basis, right? So in May 1961, a young British fan wrote into Amra, which was one of the leading fan magazines for Conan the Barbarian. Robert E. Howard had taken his life 25 years earlier, but the proliferation of authors who were inspired by his style was keeping the fandom strong. This young British fan wanted to become one of those authors. His name was Michael Moorcock, and with his heroes like Elric, Coram, Hawkmoon, and others, he would go on to become one of the most important pulp fantasy authors of all time. He would go on to publish his very first Elric story, The Dreaming City, 1 month later. But for now, he had a very important question to ask the fandom. What do we even call this subgenre? In his iconic open letter to the Conan the Barbarian fandom, entitled Putting a Tag on It, he has this to say: "We have two tags, really, sci-fi and fantasy, but I feel that we should have another general name to include the subgenre of books which deal with Middle Earths and lands and worlds based on this planet, worlds which only exist in some author's vivid imagination. In this subgenre, I would classify books like The Worm Ouroboros, Jurgen, The Lord of the Rings, The Once and Future King, the Grey Mouser and Fafhrd series, the Conan series, The Broken Sword, The Well of the Unicorn, etc. Now, all these stories have several things in common. They are fantasy stories which could hardly be classified as sci-fi, and they are stories of high adventure, generally featuring a central hero very easy to identify oneself with. For the most part, they are works of escapism, anything else usually being secondary. Exceptions, I would agree, are Jurgen and The Once and Future King, but all of them are tales told for the tale's sake, and the authors have obviously thoroughly enjoyed the telling. The roots of most of these stories are in legendary, classic romance, mythology, folklore, and dubious ancient works of history. Epic fantasy is the name which appeals most to me as one which includes many of these stories. Certainly all the ones I have mentioned. So that is really interesting. This is the first time the term epic fantasy has ever been used, as far as I am aware. But notice how in the works that Moorcock provided, he includes pulp fantasy and novelistic fantasy interchangeably. To put it simply, The Lord of the Rings and Conan the Barbarian are placed in the exact same category. After all, they are tied together by a love for mythology, folklore, and history. Why shouldn't they be in the same category? Now, I am going to take you back in time 2 months earlier, March 1961. This was in Calagon #1, the first issue in a short-lived fan magazine for fans of the fantasy genre who lived in the Philadelphia metro area. The editor of this fanzine was a man named George R. Heap, and in this very first issue, he asks the same question: what do we call this genre that we are all fans of? He comes up with a different term: the fantasy adventure. He offers this definition: fantasy adventure is a branch of fantasy which, in turn, is part of what L. Sprague de Camp calls, in his science fiction handbook, imaginative, as opposed to realistic fiction. This general class also includes science fiction. I would like to start off with a few intuitive exclusions. What adventure fantasy is not. It is, first of all, not the traditional stories of ghosts, werewolves, pacts with the devil, etc. laid in the world as we or our ancestors know it. Neither does it include the lost race fantasies without supernatural elements, thus excluding most of H.R. Haggard's fantasies. It is not supernatural horror a la H.P. Lovecraft. It is not stories of quasi-real lands such as Islandia or the Grostarkian romances as The Prisoner of Zenda. By some accounts, these last are not fantasies at all. In particular, I would exclude the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Not with any malice or distaste, they just do not fit the fantasy adventure class. Then what is fantasy adventure? Well, let us begin with the fantasy element itself. There should be a strong element of the supernatural, spells, wizardry, and tokens of magic power as an essential part of the story. A second point of definition is the culture level of the story, in particular as to the weapons and transportation used. The general cultural level then, defined in terms of our timeline, should be pre-gunpowder, medieval, or earlier. The third and last is the thing that, to me at least, is the most important: the world background of the story. It may well be the most difficult thing for the author of such stories to create convincingly. The contradictory requirements are that it be both alien and familiar, or is it familiar with a difference? The main thing to that familiarity portion is that it be a human background. I am stretching the term human to include hobbits, elves, and demons, as long as they are given human emotions and motivations in more or less human shapes. So George R. Heap defines fantasy adventure pretty differently than how Michael Moorcock defines epic fantasy. While Moorcock defines epic fantasy by its inspirations, Heap defines fantasy adventure by what it does in the actual text of the story, that it includes magic, that it has a pre-modern technology level, and that it still ultimately ties into the human experience despite the supernatural world building. Heap provides a list of books that he says are emblematic of the fantasy adventure subgenre. His list includes The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson, The Tritonian Ring by L. Sprague de Camp, The Worm Ouroboros and the Zimiamvian Trilogy by E.R. Edison, The Conan Stories by Robert E. Howard, The Dark World by Henry Kuttner, The Fafhrd and Grey Mouser Stories by Fritz Leiber, The Ship of Ishtar by A. Merritt, The Well of the Unicorn by Fletcher Pratt, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, and The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. So not only does he also cite pulp fantasy in addition to novelistic fantasy interchangeably, his list has a 90% overlap with the list that Michael Moorcock provides for epic fantasy. So 1 month after George R. Heap published his essay about fantasy adventure in Encalagon number 1, Fritz Leiber, acclaimed author of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories, and probably the most acclaimed author in pulp fantasy at the time, wrote into Encalagon number 2 in the April of 1961. And this is his response to the concept of fantasy adventure. I feel more certain than ever that this field should be called the sword and sorcery story. This accurately describes the points of culture level and supernatural element, and also immediately distinguishes it from the cloak and sword, aka historical adventure story, and quite incidentally from the cloak and dagger, aka international espionage story too. There are many possibilities along this line. Cloak and mask for comic book heroes, cutlass and dagger for piracy, rocket and ray gun for space opera, and vine and loincloth for Tarzan. The term sword and sorcery was floating around in the early 20th century, but this is the first time anyone had ever used it to describe the fantasy genre. But there is a big problem. Notice that Fritz Leiber isn't saying, let's use the term sword and sorcery to differentiate pulp fantasy from the novelistic fantasy that J.R.R. Tolkien and T.H. White are writing. He is saying, let's use the term sword and sorcery to differentiate fantasy as a whole from these other pulp subgenres. Here's where things get even more complicated. Later that year, in the July 1961 issue of Amra, which I should add was an issue all about how Salambo by Gustave Flaubert should be considered as one of the great inspirations for Conan the Barbarian and the rest of the fantasy genre, which I find awesome and hilarious. The editor took Fritz Leiber's comment from Encalagon number 2 and reprinted it as a response to Michael Moorcock's open letter about how to define their particular subgenre of fantasy. And because Amra was a more popular magazine, and the fact that Fritz Leiber was an esteemed writer within pulp fantasy, the name sword and sorcery stuck to describe fantasy where people have swords and wield magic. People are using and defining sword and sorcery by these two radically different definitions that are being provided in these two original essays, because the Fritz Leiber response was applied to both of them. Not just that, under both of these definitions, Lord of the Rings is not considered its own separate subgenre, but as a different form of sword and sorcery. In the late 1960s, L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter oversee the first paperback run of Conan the Barbarian. Their proliferation of Conan the Barbarian in paperback format was a smash success and helped make Conan the figure of pop culture that he is today. However, their treatment of Conan is also very controversial, because what they did is insert their own Conan the Barbarian Barbarian short stories that they wrote themselves in between the stories that were originally written by Robert E. Howard. And their stories were notably weaker than the ones that Howard wrote. So, because of their influence, Conan was able to become a smash hit, but at the same time, Conan developed this unfair representation of being a dumb brute because they weren't able to write stories to the same degree of skill that Robert E. Howard did. In the original paperback release of Conan the Barbarian in 1967, entitled simply Conan, L. Sprague de Camp tries to redefine the fantasy subgenre that Conan was written in to make a term that is more understandable to newcomers to the genre than sword and sorcery. The term he chooses is heroic fantasy. In his own words, heroic fantasy is the name I have given to a subgenre of fiction, otherwise called the sword and sorcery story. It is a story of action and adventure laid in a more or less imaginary world where magic works and where modern science and technology have not yet been discovered. The setting may, as in the Conan stories, be this Earth as it is conceived to have been long ago, or as it will be in the remote future, or it may be another planet or another dimension. Such a story combines the color and dash of the historical costume romance with the atavistic supernatural thrills of the weird, occult, or ghost story. When well done, it provides the purest fun of fiction of any kind. It is escape fiction where one escapes clear out of the real world into one where all men are strong, all women beautiful, all life adventurous, and all problems simple, and nobody even mentions the income tax or the dropout problem or socialized medicine. His definition pretty cleanly lines up with the pulp fantasy that we call sword and sorcery today. However, he continues, William Morris pioneered the heroic fantasy in Great Britain in the 1880s. In the early years of the century, Lord Dunsany and Eric R. Edison developed the genre further. In the 1930s, the appearance of the magazines Weird Tales and, later, Unknown Worlds furnished outlets for stories of this type, and many memorable sword and sorcery narratives were written. These include Howard's stories of Conan, Cole, and Solomon Kane, Clark Ashton Smith's macabre tales of Hyperborea, Atlantis, Averoigne, and the future continent Zothique, Henry Kuttner's Atlantean stories, C.L. Moore's narratives of Giro of Joyery, and Fritz Leiber's Grey Mouser stories. I might also mention Fletcher Pratt's and My Tales of Harold Shea. After the Second World War, the magazine market for stories of this kind shrank, and it looked for a while as if fantasy had become a casualty of the machine age. Then, with the publication of J.R.R. Tolkien's trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, and the reprinting of many earlier works in the field, the genre revived. Now it is flourishing again, and it is inevitable that one of its giants, Robert E. Howard, and his greatest imaginative effort, the Conan saga, should be made available. L. Sprague de Camp would go on to write Literary Swordsmen and Sorcerers, the makers of heroic fantasy for Arkham House, where he doubles down on this definition, saying that authors as diverse as William Morris and Lord Dunsany and H.P. Lovecraft and E.R. Edison and Robert E. Howard and Fletcher Pratt and Clark Ashton Smith and J.R.R. Tolkien and T.H. White are all the masters of heroic fantasy, which is to be understood as being synonymous with sword and sorcery, which is to be understood as being synonymous with fantasy adventure, which is to be understood to be synonymous with epic fantasy. Do you see why I'm going crazy? Every single one of these sources agrees that no matter how you divide up the fantasy genre, Conan the Barbarian and Lord of the Rings are ultimately of the same cloth, whatever that might be. And so, to wind all the way back, it's foolish to define low fantasy versus high fantasy as being synonymous with sword and sorcery versus epic fantasy, because nobody can agree what sword and sorcery and epic fantasy means. Conan the Barbarian is often called epic fantasy. Lord of the Rings has often been called sword and sorcery by a wide variety of sources. There is a light in the tunnel, or maybe a darkness of the pit, who knows? Notice how throughout all of these essays about terms, not a single person has actually used the phrase high fantasy yet. We don't even know what high fantasy means. The term high fantasy doesn't get coined until 1971. But let me tell you, buddy, that's not gonna make the answers any easier. If anything, it's just gonna complicate things farther. In 1971, Lloyd Alexander, author of iconic Mabinogian-inspired young adult fantasy series The Chronicles of Prydain, later adapted into Disney's best movie, The Black Cauldron, published an essay entitled High Fantasy and Heroic Romance, based off of a lecture that he had given 2 years earlier. This essay is universally recognized as inventing and popularizing the term high fantasy. I am led to believe that none of these YouTubers who reference the essay have actually read it. But I read it. I read it for you. And I recommend that you find a copy and read it for yourself. While it is not as theoretically all-encompassing as On Fairy Stories, I still think that it is a very useful read. I would even go so far to say that this essay provides my new favorite definition of high fantasy, and the one that I personally will probably be using going forward. Lloyd Alexander opens up the essay talking about how fantasy as a storytelling art has roots that go back thousands of years. In modern literature, one form that draws most directly from the fountainhead of mythology and does it consciously and deliberately is the heroic romance, which is a form of high fantasy. If anyone can be credited with inventing the heroic romance as we know it today, that is, in the form of a novel using epic, saga, and chanson de geste as some of its raw materials, it must be William Morris in such books as The Wood Beyond the World and The Water of the Wondrous Isles. Certainly, Morris showed the tremendous strength and potential of the heroic romance as an artistic vehicle, which was later to be used by Lord Dunsany, Eric Edison, James Branch Cabell, by C.S. Lewis and T.H. White. Of course, heroic romance is the basis of the superb achievements of J.R.R. Tolkien. Writers of heroic romance who work directly in the tradition and within the conventions of an earlier body of literature and legend draw from a common source, the pot of soup, as Tolkien calls it, the cauldron of story, which has been simmering away since time immemorial. The pot holds a rich and fascinating kind of mythological minestrone. Almost everything has gone into it, and almost anything is likely to come out of it. Morsels of real history, spiced and spliced with imaginary history, fact and fancy, daydreams and nightmares. It is as inexhaustible as those legendary vessels that could never be emptied. I think the definition that he has offered so far sounds pretty familiar to anyone who thinks about high fantasy today, right? Talking about how it draws from myth and legend and folklore. Indeed, it's not that uncommon from Michael Moorcock's definition of epic fantasy back in 1961. But this next part, which people usually don't talk about, is what redefines the definition for me and what makes it so compelling. Alexander continues, but in accordance with one of fantasy's own conventions, nothing is given for nothing. Although we are free and welcome to ladle up whatever suits our taste and fill ourselves with any mixture we please, nevertheless we have to digest it, assimilate it as thoroughly as we assimilate the objective experiences of real life. As conscious artists, we have to process it on the most personal levels. Let it work on our personalities, and above all, let our personalities work on it. Otherwise, we have what the computer people delicately call GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. He then spends several pages talking about his own history of writing fantasy. If you have read the Mabinogion as well as the Chronicles of Prydain, you will find that they are actually pretty different stories. But Lloyd Alexander explains how his secret to writing that series was taking these concepts from Welsh mythology, such as the Black Cauldron, and then combining it with his own lived experiences to produce something entirely new. For example, he talks about stumbling upon a one-off reference in Celtic mythology to some sort of half-man, half-ape creature. It wasn't until much later, when he, as a young author, was feeling particularly insecure about himself and his own writing habits, that he combined this ape creature with his own insecurity to produce
the character of Gurgi.
He follows up with, "My point in these examples is simply this. A writer of fantasy, like any writer, must find the essential content of his work within himself, in his own personality, in his own attitude and commitment to real life. Whatever form we take in, fantasy or realism, books for children or for adults, I believe that the fundamental creative process is the same. In his work, the author may be very heavily disguised or altogether anonymous. I do not think he is ever totally absent." I find this quietly revolutionary. High fantasy isn't just writing fiction with wizards and dragons that calls back to the mythology and legend of yore. You have to internalize base building blocks of the human story, filter them through your own personality, through your own idiosyncrasies, and then produce something entirely new. Once I started thinking about high fantasy in this way, most of my favorite works of that proposed subgenre suddenly make sense. The Lord of the Rings and the Broken Sword are based on the exact same Norse mythology, and yet those books are radically different in tone and scope because J.R.R. Tolkien and Poul Anderson are two radically different people. How can Lloyd Alexander, Kenneth Morris, Alan Garner, and of course Evangeline Walton all use the exact same working source material of the Welsh Mabinogion and end up producing four equally excellent but completely different works of Welsh-inspired mythology? It's because all four of them are distinct idiosyncratic writers, and by using the same base source material, we can better appreciate the novels that each of them writes as exemplifications of their particular strengths as authors. Under Lloyd Alexander's definition, Star Wars by George Lucas is the height of high fantasy filmmaking. So many people are always very happy to tell you, you know, the reason why Star Wars is so good is because George Lucas studied Joseph Campbell's monomyth. He read The Hero of a Thousand Faces. He deliberately made Star Wars stick to the story circle of steps. That's why Star Wars was able to become so iconic. This is usually followed by a recommendation that you too should stick to Joseph Campbell's paradigm. And I want to be clear, Campbell's work has rightfully, in my opinion, become increasingly controversial in recent years for claiming a certain level of universality that his mythic studies do not actually achieve. But people keep telling you, if you want to write an iconic story, make sure you stick to Joseph Campbell's monomyth. And it leads to lots of extraordinarily boring and shitty fiction. Turns out that when you're sticking to a structure which is a generalized form of all human myth, then you end up with a very generic final product. So no, sticking to the monomyth is not what made Star Wars such an impactful film. It's the fact that George Lucas is a super weird dude, and I mean that as a compliment. George Lucas took this very generalized, universal structure and then filtered it through his own weird obsessions with Buck Rogers and samurai movies and World War II dogfights. The end product is a story that feels universal but also feels super unique due to the peculiarities of George Lucas's hyperfixations. Star Wars is sui generis. George Lucas was the only person who could have made Star Wars. The corporate hierarchy at Disney keeps trying to replicate what they think feels like Star Wars, rather than creating something entirely new. So we end up with complete slop like The Mandalorian and Grogu, which is this Baudrillardian simulacrum, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of George Lucas's original product. I think it is very telling that all of the recent Star Wars media that have felt successful is from auteurs being able to inject their own interests and personality into the material. Tony Gilroy, creator of Andor, takes this cultural notion of Star Wars as his mythic structure, but injects in his own personal obsessions with 20th century revolutionary history and political thriller films like The Battle of Algiers or the Wannsee Conference. By going out of his way to not stick to the vague cultural notion of what Star Wars is, but instead creating a personalized narrative, Andor felt fresh fresh and exciting in a way that Star Wars hasn't felt for many a year. Going back to Lloyd Alexander's essay, he only cites these novelistic fantasy authors as exemplifying what he is talking about. However, I think you could very easily argue that Conan the Barbarian is high fantasy under his definition. Robert E. Howard was a man who was absolutely obsessed with ancient cultures and mythology. He then filtered these ancient mythologies and cultures through his own strong personality of Texan machismo. His own personal notions of masculinity then end up informing Conan the Barbarian as a character. I have seen people claim that Lloyd Alexander, in writing this essay, was going out of his way to snub Conan the Barbarian and these other pulp fantasy authors. Maybe that's the case, but maybe it's not the case. The problem is, he doesn't cite any clear and specific examples of what he considers to be non-high fantasy, which leads to the next problem. Lloyd Alexander wrote this essay defining high fantasy, but not once does he mention or even consider the possibility of there being a low fantasy. High fantasy is not being contrasted with low fantasy, it's being contrasted with fantasy writ large. And I think that is the fundamental problem that has led to low fantasy being such a shaky term over the years. It was never meant to exist. As we all know, Aragorn is the High King of Gondor. Does that mean there is a low King of Gondor? No, not really. Oh, the cowboy fight took place at high noon. Does that mean that there is a low noon? Not really. There are many instances in the English language of the word high being used to elevate a concept. I mean, it's in the very word, but that does not imply a dualism, that everything that is high must necessarily exist to the mutual exclusion of everything that is low. You can have stuff that is high, stuff that is low, and stuff that is medium. Oh, I just graduated from high school. Does that mean that there is a low school that you did not graduate from? There are gradations in human language, and assuming that all fantasy necessarily has to fall into this high versus low dichotomy is foolish. I could honestly end the video right there, now that we've proved that low fantasy doesn't even exist. But maybe it can exist, and maybe it should exist, so I will keep going. So where does the term low fantasy even come from? Well, I actually do have an answer for that, but for structural reasons, I am going to jump much farther in time to the year 2008, and hopefully that'll help us elucidate low fantasy later on in the video. In the year 2008, Farah Mendlesohn, internationally acclaimed scholar of fantasy and science fiction, published Rhetorics of Fantasy. This book is a work of taxonomy, where she splits up the entirety of fantasy literature into 4 categories. And those 4 categories are structures. They are not subgenres. This is important. This is very, very important. A taxonomy is a superstructure that you can use to divide the entirety of a thing into smaller buckets. They are exclusive and meant to entail everything that the superstructure covers. Just like how people will throw the entirety of narrative conflict into one of 3 buckets, like man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self. And you know, other people will come up with more like man versus God, man versus society. But the point is, you don't go to a movie theater and say, oh, I can't wait to watch the new Man versus Man film this weekend, because movies that are about the conflict between 2 different human beings can fall into literally any genre or any subgenre. So to be clear, when Farah Mendlesohn proposes these 4 structures of fantasy, that does not mean that there are 4 subgenres of fantasy. Any of these structures can hypothetically be found in any subgenre. However, some of these structures lend themselves to certain subgenres better than others, and that is where we start to get some confusion. So to put them out on the table, the 4 structures are the portal/quest fantasy, the immersive fantasy, the intrusive fantasy, and the liminal fantasy. It is very common to claim that intrusive fantasy is synonymous with low fantasy. That is what brings us here today. But let's look at these other structures first. The first of these structures is the portal/quest fantasy. Portal fantasy is a term that has been in use for a pretty long time, and as you can imagine, it's generally used to describe fantasy stories where people from our world go to a world that is not our own. The most famous examples being The Wizard of Oz, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever, and so forth. However, this term has found new life in recent years as people use it as an English language equivalent to the Japanese subgenre name isekai. Isekai in Japanese literally means another world. And I'm gonna be real, they're all basically the same. This complete loser gets hit by a truck, and then they get teleported into some fantasy world with lit RPG elements, and the god of that world says, "Hey loser, you have been randomly chosen to become the greatest warrior/wizard who ever lives. Now you get your own harem of ambiguously underaged elf chicks that you can fondle whenever you want." If it's not immediately obvious, I have literally no respect for isekai as a subgenre. It's almost exclusively used as shameless power fantasy rampant with racism and misogyny. And they're all terrible! There is not a single one that is good! I know this from experience! So it really pisses me off when these 14-year-old fans of isekai say, well actually that's just the same thing as portal fantasy. You know, Chronicles of Narnia was the first isekai. They are using these completely unrelated works to launder the reputation of isekai, to normalize it, to make it seem like a worthy and literary genre, which it is not! Now that I am done with my crash out, I am going to proceed. According to Farah Mendlesohn, what makes something a portal/quest fantasy is not the presence of a portal, or really any means of transporting between worlds. Portal is in the name because such teleportation is common, but it's not necessary. What makes something a portal/quest fantasy is how information is relegated to the reader. What it's actually asking is there a center viewpoint character who we, the reader, are identifying with whom we are learning about the wider fantasy world? So yes, Dorothy Gale is learning about Oz at the same time the reader is learning about Oz. Thomas Covenant is learning about the land at the same time the reader is learning about the land. That all seems obvious enough. However, this structure also applies to works that are not traditionally thought of as portal fantasies. That's why it's portal/quest. One of the biggest examples being Lord of the Rings. Frodo and the other hobbits are very sheltered in the Shire, and when they go out into the bigger world, to Bree, to Rivendell, to Moria, to Lothlorien, and so on, they are learning about the wider world of Middle-earth in real time. And you, the reader, are learning about Middle-earth through more knowledgeable characters like Aragorn or Gandalf explaining it to the hobbits. This is why the idea of the farm boy is such a common protagonist trope in 80s and 90s post-Tolkien fantasy. If your main character doesn't know anything about anything, then you, the reader, can learn alongside them. The next structure is immersive fantasy, where you, the reader, are observing this fantasy world as a complete outsider. You don't get a viewpoint character to have the world's intricacies explained to. Instead, you are viewing it through a more neutral prism, and you are left to sink or swim whether or not you are able to follow the world's perhaps intricate and dense world building. I think a very famous example of this is Malazan Book of the Fallen. You are thrown into the deep end with these dozens or even hundreds of characters who all have their own wants, fears, politics, and histories that have been going on for decades upon decades before the reader started following their story. The third type of fantasy is intrusive fantasy. So in these first two structures, we are treated to worlds where magic and other fantasy elements are more or less seen as normal. However, in an intrusive fantasy, magic or other supernatural elements are aberrant and unexpected, often set on our world, or any other setting where supernatural elements breaking the laws of causality are seen as impossible. Farah Mendlesohn says that this form of structure most easily easily lends itself to horror. Think of the works of H.P. Lovecraft, which almost exclusively concern themselves with normal human beings grappling with ancient alien gods and dark magic, and literally not having the capability of comprehending them. That's where the horror stems from. However, it needs to be made abundantly clear that just because something is set on Earth does not mean that it is intrusive fantasy. For example, Harry Potter is intrusive fantasy for the first couple of chapters. Think of all the letters coming through the doors, him falling into the zoo glass with the snake. All of these unexpected magical happenings are going on, and they are legitimately scary because Harry Potter and the other characters do not know what's going on. However, once Hagrid shows up and whisks him away to Hogwarts, then Harry Potter transforms into a portal/quest fantasy. Then it becomes about graduating Hogwarts and defeating the Dark Lord and learning about the wizarding world through the prism of Harry Potter. Before I continue on with intrusive fantasy and its possible relationship with low fantasy, I will touch on the fourth structure, which is the one that is discussed the least, and that is liminal fantasy, which Farah Mendlesohn defines as fantasy that refuses to acknowledge that it is fantasy. The readers realize is a fantasy work, but people inside of the novel do not recognize as a fantasy. Some of the examples she provides include Lud in the Mist, where none of the characters want to acknowledge that their sleepy English town is being affected by the illegal import of fairy fruit, as well as Little Big by John Crowley, where none of the characters are really acknowledging that their lives are being impacted by the machinations of fairies. Here's the crazy thing about rhetorics of fantasy. Do you know how many times the term low fantasy is used in this book? Exactly 0 times! So then you might ask, why do people in these YouTube explainers keep saying that low fantasy is the same thing as intrusive fantasy? Well, the answer to that is simple. Wikipedia claims that the two are the same thing. And it only claims that the two are the same thing because a semi-anonymous editor in November of 2017 made an edit claiming that it was. Before November 2017, the article for low fantasy got its definition from the 2009 Brian Stableford Encyclopedia of Fantasy from A to Z, where he provides a definition of low fantasy, and we will examine that definition in a bit, mind you. This is off the top of my dome, so this is a bit of a paraphrase. But he says that his definition of low fantasy roughly corresponds with Farah Mendlesohn's idea of intrusive fantasy. However, he makes it very clear that the two of them are not the same thing. They just have very heavy overlap. So now the two of them are treated as the same thing, all thanks to this overeager, semi-anonymous Wikipedia editor from 9 years ago. Even though in her book, Farah Mendlesohn says you can have intrusive fantasy in what might otherwise be considered high fantasy or otherwise secondary world contexts. It takes a lot of work, but it can be done, like Perdido Street Station, which is an immersive fantasy in a secondary world where you have all of these different weird and interesting alien races going around and there's all this magic, and then one day, as part of one of the book's many subplots, an extra-dimensional butterfly demon called the Slake Moth arrives in the city and starts sucking out people's dreams. So while magic is normal to the people in this world, the Slake Moth isn't. You can include intrusive fantasy elements in a created secondary world, or an epic fantasy series, or basically any other high fantasy novel. It is supremely fallacious to claim that the subgenre of low fantasy and the taxonomical structure of intrusive fantasy are synonymous. But now, because all these YouTube explainers are just citing the Wikipedia article, or alternatively, they're citing their Google search, which now cites the Wikipedia article, example, you always hear low fantasy, also known as intrusive fantasy, before they go on to give a definition which is A, not intrusive fantasy, and B, cites works of fantasy that also are clearly not intrusive fantasy. If someone claims that Game of Thrones is an intrusive fantasy, they are full of fucking shit. Game of Thrones is intrusive because it's a normal medieval world that is being intruded upon by dragons. People in Westeros know what dragons are. It's on the fucking coat of arms of the Targaryens. Everyone knows what dragons are. A Song of Ice and Fire is many things, but that is a very clear-cut example of immersive fantasy, not intrusive. But let us ask once and for all, what is the official academic definition of low fantasy? Brian Stableford said that it correlated with intrusive fantasy, but it was not the same thing. Well, let us go back in time to 1979, when Marshall B. Tim, Kenneth J. Zahorsky, and Robert H. Boyer published the nonfiction book Fantasy Literature, a Core Collection and Reference Guide. Zahorsky and Boyer were two of the most important fantasy academics in the late 1970s. They published a series of popular anthologies, starting with The Fantastic Imagination Stories of High Fantasy, where they take Lloyd Alexander's term high fantasy and they transformed it into a much wider definition, which more or less sticks today. They are also the first people to define, in an academic context, the term low fantasy. So let's see what they have to say. You've sat down for this long in the video. Maybe it'll pay off with the official definition. Maybe. Maybe not. We'll see. Here is the distinction in their own words. The significant use of non-rational phenomena not only enables us to distinguish between fantasy and the various other branches of literature, but also serves as one of the two principal criteria, the other is setting, that guide us in dividing the genre into its two major classifications, high fantasy and low fantasy. These two criteria are interrelated, since setting in fantasy refers to the type of world described, and non-rational phenomena are governed by the laws that prevail in this world. The worlds of high fantasy are secondary worlds, such as the Forest Sauvage, Middle-earth, or Prydain, and they manifest a consistent order that is explainable in terms of the supernatural, i.e. deities, or in terms of the less definable but still recognizable magical powers of fairy, e.g. wizards and enchantresses. Hence, The Once and Future King by T.H. White and The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien and The Black Cauldron by Lloyd Alexander are high fantasy. On the other hand, the world of low fantasy is the primary world, this real world we live in. It too demonstrates a consistent order, but its order is explainable in terms of natural law, which excludes the supernatural and the magical for the most part. The gods and fairies no longer, alas, walk here. Consequently, when something non-rational occurs, as it does in low fantasies such as Peter S. Beagle's Lila the Werewolf and Oscar Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray, there are no explanations, rational or non-rational. The causes simply are not forthcoming. They are inexplicable. In a high fantasy secondary world, the metamorphosis of a young lady into a wolf or the aging of the Portrait of Dorian Gray would be explained by some magical or supernatural agency that would be accepted in that world. So Boyer and Zahorsky are clearly two very smart men. But you can see from this definition they provide, although it is a good and holistic definition, the roots of all of the problems we have been dealing with throughout this entire video. They are the ones who are claiming that primary versus secondary world means Earth versus an invented setting. You can also see why people using their definition would be quick to align Farah Mendelssohn's intrusive fantasy with their definition of low fantasy. But each of these two definitions of high fantasy versus low fantasy have two different axes. They define high fantasy being A, set on a secondary world, and B, magic is normal or even common. They then go ahead and say that low fantasy is set on the primary world, aka real life Earth, and that any magic is intrusive. But providing two different axes for these definitions begs the question, what if you have a novel that is set on a secondary world that has absolutely no magic, where magic would be intrusive, like Gormenghast? used? Or, on the other hand, what if you have fantasy that is set on the primary world where magic is common and is a part of everyday life, like urban fantasy or in Harry Potter? Boyer and Zahorsky's definitions are great for 1979, but there wasn't enough diversity in fantasy yet to demonstrate the cracks in their definitions. But every single encyclopedia of fantasy that has been written since then borrow their definitions of high and low fantasy, not accounting for all of the exceptions to their rules that have been written in the subsequent years. The other ongoing problem that stems from their work comes to how they treat sword and sorcery, or epic fantasy, or heroic fantasy, or fantasy adventure, or, well, other people also said, like, how about modern mythology? How about prehistoric adventure fantasy? Let's just say the big subgenre that Conan the Barbarian is a part of. They acknowledge that already by the late 1970s, heroic fantasy / sword and sorcery had become a very difficult term to use because nobody could agree what it means. Surprise! I could have told you that, buddy! Some people say that heroic fantasy and sword and sorcery refers to idealistic works about slaying dragons and saving maidens, while other people, especially those looking at all the Conan derivative pulp fantasy that had been written in the decades since then, say sword and sorcery is schlock for idiots. It's about using brute violence to subjugate people and to assault women. And the frustrating thing is that these hyper-positive and these hyper-negative definitions of sword and sorcery were correct to various degrees. So Boyer and Zahorsky acknowledge all of the problems that had built up in terms of trying to define sword and sorcery, and they offer a potential answer. Spoiler, they make things a lot worse. They refuse to acknowledge sword and sorcery as a potential subgenre of high fantasy, even though sword and sorcery does in fact apply to all of the definitions that they laid out. And this is their reason why. If we are to clear up some of the fuzzy and misleading genre and subgenre designations and definitions that currently plague the fantasy field, we must begin with such indefinite terms as sword and sorcery in heroic fantasy. The present use of these terms is not only confusing to teachers, librarians, students, and casual readers of the genre, it is also unjust to fantasists who are indiscriminately thrust into pigeonholes in which they do not belong. This problem is compounded because in many quarters the term sword and sorcery is synonymous with literature of poor quality. Given this feeling that sword and sorcery is escape literature with little redeeming literary value, it seems unfair to classify superb writers like William Morris, Laura Dunsany, E.R. Edison, T.H. White, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Lloyd Alexander as sword and sorcery fantasists. And this type of classification does take place on a fairly widespread basis. It also seems unjust to place any of these writers in the heroic fantasy category. It is, of course, easier to identify problems than to solve them, and the problem of genre definition that we are dealing with here has been exacerbated because of its longevity. Over the decades, it has had an opportunity to become deep-seated. The misunderstandings have had more than ample time to take seed, grow, and spread. Can anything be done to ameliorate the situation? I don't know, buddy. You seem to be describing all of the problems that you're perpetuating for me right now. Because in their opinion, sword and sorcery sucks shit, it should be considered a new genre completely unrelated to high fantasy, which they called sword and sinew. Believe it or not, that name did not stick. Even though they acknowledge that several sword and sorcery authors like Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné do have some degree of literary value, they are more interested in segregating sword and sorcery away from what they deem to be true literary novelistic fantasy. But in segregating pulp fantasy away, they have just made everything more confusing. I am realizing in real time that all of this mix-up is largely Boyer and Zahorsky's fault. If we look at the three possible definitions of high fantasy versus low fantasy, they utilized all three of them simultaneously to define high fantasy. They define high fantasy as anything that is not set on a primary world, not sword and sorcery, and not intrusive fantasy. And by defining high fantasy as all of these things simultaneously, simultaneously, it makes it impossible to differentiate what low fantasy is, even when you have their official definition staring at you right in the face. Golly gee whiz, what are we to do? We have been going for a pretty long time, but I am going to try to take us home as fast as possible. Up until now, I have used citations and sources extensively, but this next section will feel pretty different. I will mostly be arguing from my own subjective opinions. I think my opinions are good and correct, but they are still just my opinions. The reason why I'm shifting focus like that is that in this fourth and final section about potential definitions for low fantasy, the arguments that people provide become much more subjective. High fantasy is more idealistic, while low fantasy is more gritty. High fantasy is more high magic, while low fantasy is more low magic. The problem I find with definitions like these is that it is very difficult to find clear-cut delineations between high and low fantasy, because under these schema, the terms high and low fantasy are ultimately left up to the value judgments of the person who is using those terms. And this does not just apply to high and low fantasy. This actually applies to many of these potential fantasy subgenres. For example, I think the term dark fantasy can be very useful in terms of selling the general mood or tone of a work to someone else. I think dark fantasy is a good descriptor. However, that does not mean that dark fantasy is a good term for a subgenre. I've seen a lot of people throw around the definition that dark fantasy means fantasy with horror elements. And sure, I think that's as good a definition as any. But the problem is that when people call books dark fantasy, they are not necessarily using that definition, but instead using that term to describe whatever they personally deem to be dark subject matter. But what constitutes dark subject matter can shift radically from person to person. So what I'm saying is, dark fantasy is a useful term if you are recommending a book to a friend, but it's far less useful of a term if you're trying to define a top 100 dark fantasy books of all time, because you can argue day in and day out what actually constitutes dark fantasy. And as you can imagine, my frustration around this subjectivity of these types of definitions is exactly why I don't like defining low versus high fantasy as meaning gritty versus idealistic. A lot of book series that are described by its fans as grimdark and nihilistic, such as The Acts of Cain or Malazan Book of the Fallen, are ultimately about the strength of the human spirit. So does the inner core of idealism maintained in a bleak world actually make those books far more idealistic than they would be otherwise? Fans cannot agree. Authors cannot agree, and that's a problem. The example of this dichotomy that I take particular umbrage with is, as you can imagine, George Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire versus J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And yes, those books can get pretty bleak and gruesome. I am not contesting that. What I do take issue with is how people, in an effort to establish George Martin's books as dark and gritty, will talk about the Lord of the Rings and the rest of Tolkien's legendarium as if it was just some blandly idealistic Disneyland ride. And I would say no, I would disagree with that vehemently. This becomes far more apparent if you have read the Silmarillion, which Tolkien intended to be published alongside the Lord of the Rings back in 1954. He wanted it to be a 4-volume set. You would get your Hobbit sequel, but then you would also get your dense history of the elves explaining why Middle-earth is the way that it is. Tolkien always wanted them to be read alongside each other. But believe it or not, publishers during World War II in the post-war period were really not interested in wasting valuable paper on this dense elven history that seemed to have very little marketable value. I love the Silmarillion to death, but I do not blame them. This discouraged Tolkien, who never got around to 100% completing the Silmarillion in his lifetime. The Silmarillion is a story of never-ending loss and degradation. And by the time we get to Lord of the Rings, most of the elves we meet are frankly too traumatized by their thousands of years of bloody war history to lift a finger to stop Sauron. No matter how heroic or good your characters are, you will never bring back the light of the two lamps. You will never bring back the light of the two trees. You will never bring back sunken Beleriand. You will never bring back Gondolin and all of the other fallen kingdoms. So yes, the Lord of the Rings has a happy ending. The ring is destroyed and Sauron is stopped and Aragorn ascends to the throne. But things will never be as good as they once were. All they've done is stop the world from getting even worse for the span of a couple hundred or thousand years. And that deep, all-encompassing sadness permeates every single word of The Lord of the Rings. That is what makes it such a beautiful book. So, if we are evaluating high versus low fantasy as happy and idealistic works versus sad and cynical works, I could very well choose to evaluate The Lord of the Rings as low fantasy. I'm not sure if I would, but I could. You can't stop me. Evaluating something as idealistic versus cynical is a complex dance between the author's intentions and how the reader receives those intentions. And so, at the end of the day, I don't think it is a very useful metric because that is going to change from person to person. The next of these subjective metrics that I really don't enjoy is the evaluation of high magic versus low magic. YouTube explainers will always be like, in a high fantasy world, magic is everywhere and a common part of people's daily lives, while in a low fantasy world, magic is rare or even non-existent. Yada yada yada. And then, as you can imagine, here it comes. High fantasy is typified by The Lord of the Rings and low fantasy is typified by A Game of Thrones. So here is the problem. This is an extraordinarily spicy take on my part, but I think I am correct in saying A Game of Thrones has so much more magic than Lord of the Rings. Are you kidding me? Magic is not a common part of people's lives in The Lord of the Rings. That's the whole fucking point of the Shire. These hobbits don't experience magic. They don't hang out with elves. Their only exposure to magic is through the fact that Frodo is friends with the one guy in a 1,000-mile radius who knows how to cast spells. And then he stumbles into the forest and meets Tom Bombadil. But is Tom Bombadil magic? Is he God? Who knows? There used to be lots of magic in Middle-earth, but the vast majority of it has faded by the time Lord of the Rings occurs. That's what makes this one evil magic artifact such a big fucking deal. On the other hand, in A Song of Ice and Fire, we have blood magic, and shadow magic, and fire magic, and necromancy, and all 6 of the Stark children are wargs who are psychically linked to their wolves in various capacities, and Bran is training to become a fucking psychic crow wizard. Do you know how many psychic crow wizards are in Lord of the Rings? None that I can think of. And it becomes even more ludicrous if we are defining low versus high fantasy by the amount of fantasy creatures. House of the Dragon. Oh, that has 27 fucking dragons. That must mean it's 27 times more fucking magical than The Hobbit. Maybe if you did some big long accounting of all of these books, you might ultimately discover that yes, Lord of the Rings does in fact have more magic on a per chapter capita basis or whatever. But my point is, it's not just so clear cut as Game of Thrones has little to no magic versus Lord of the Rings having commonplace everyday magic. This is a categorization that claims objectivity but is actually far more subjective than people are willing to admit. If you want to see an awful example of this, I recommend going to the TV tropes page for low fantasy. I spent hours upon hours on TV tropes throughout middle school and high school. You can probably credit it for being the basis of a lot of my media knowledge. But in my opinion, my media literacy became a lot better once I realized TV tropes was limiting the way I thought about story. And so if we look at the TV tropes page for low fantasy, we will see that they evaluate it using so many of these semi-subjective markers such as grittiness or a crap sack world. All of these simultaneously, mind you, that their definition doesn't really really amount to anything. If you look at some of the listed works that exemplify low fantasy, then you have House of the Dragon, Hoodwinked, and Ted? What are we even doing here? If your definition is so vague and free-flowing that all of these disparate works can be grouped together, then it's useless as a definition. To close out this section about subjective definitions of low fantasy as typified by A Game of Thrones, let's look at a little quote from the man himself, George R.R. Martin, who I think has been largely responsible for driving this Song of Ice and Fire versus Lord of the Rings divide. I apologize I don't know this off the top of my head. It was in the early 2010s, so it would have been the press tour for A Dance of Dragons or for one of the early seasons of Game of Thrones. When he was asked about how his writing was differentiated from others, he had this to say: "Ruling is hard. This was maybe my answer to Tolkien, whom, as much as I admire him, I do quibble with. Lord of the Rings had a very medieval philosophy, that if the king was a good man, the land would prosper. We look at real history and it's not that simple. Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years, and he was wise and good. But Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? Did he maintain a standing army? What did he do in times of flood and famine? And what about all those orcs? By the end of the war, Sauron is gone, but all of the orcs aren't gone. They're in the mountains. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide and kill them? Even the little baby orcs in their orc cradles?" So here's the thing. I think George R.R. Martin is a good writer, but this is such a mind-numbingly stupid quote and such a profoundly bad faith read of Tolkien in his work that it makes me wonder, is George Martin a hack? I think it's okay for him to make the point that his work is more focused on politics and economics and logistics than most. His series is about the internecine civil wars between squabbling lords in a fantasy world. Yeah, for his books, tax policy is important, but I think turning it around and claiming that Tolkien is at fault for not immaculately detailing tax policy is a really boneheaded thing to do. Tolkien was a man who was obsessed about these books, was obsessed with the world building, literally thought of it as a mission from God. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if Tolkien did think about Aragorn's tax policy. Do you know why he doesn't outline it in the books? Cause it's fucking boring and not relevant to the story. Do you read Le Morte d'Arthur and say, well, what was King Arthur's tax policy? No, because it's not relevant to the chivalric tone of those stories. You're reading the Prose Edda, you're reading about Odin as king of the Aesir. What was Odin's tax policy? Turns out that when you let yourself be crucified on Yggdrasil for 9 straight days, it doesn't really matter too much. Tolkien was writing a story that was indebted to the chivalric romances and mythological legends, where, surprise, surprise, tax policy does not matter too much. And what's more, in Rhetorics of Fantasy, Farah Mendelssohn mentions that the only sequences of The Lord of the Rings that are truly immersive, that could function as their own standalone immersive fantasy, are the sequences set in the Shire at the very beginning and the very end of the book. The Shire is the only place on the map where you truly get a full sense of the politics and culture and way of life of these people. And that makes sense, because the meta-narrative of The Lord of the Rings isn't that Tolkien wrote it himself. He is translating The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Silmarillion from accounts that were co-authored by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam. So yes, it makes sense that these hobbits wouldn't have a holistic idea of Gondor's politics. Not only that, but of course Frodo and Sam are gonna be under the impression that Aragorn is a uniformly good king, destined to take the throne and have his bloodline reign forever and ever. Poor broken Frodo with his 9 fingers isn't spending his waning years litigating Aragorn's tax policy. That is simply outside of his purview as a person. person. Furthermore, there is all this edgelordy bullshit about orcs. Did Aragorn pursue a policy of systematic genocide against orc babies in their orc cradles? I have two things to say about that. The first, the goblins as portrayed in The Lord of the Rings are whipped into warfare by the evil machinations of Sauron. He forced them to go to war on this mass scale when, for the most part, they would prefer staying inside their mountain homes. This is a secondary citation rather than a primary citation of Tolkien, but I always think of the iconic 1980 Rankin Bass animated adaptation of The Return of the King, where in the Goblin musical number, Where There's a Whip, There's a Way, the goblins sing, "We don't want to go to war today, but the Lord of the Lash says nay, nay, nay." My interpretation, which might not be the right interpretation, is that the goblins are ultimately too sniveling and cowardly to be a serious threat when there isn't a Dark Lord around. Furthermore, Tolkien himself was the foremost critic of how orcs were portrayed in The Lord of the Rings. He realized that he had written himself into a theological corner. As we established earlier, Tolkien believed, according to his Catholic beliefs, that only God can create. The devil, or evil as a whole, cannot create. It can only corrupt God's creations against goodness. As such, his original backstory for the orcs is that they were originally elves or humans who were twisted and corrupted by Morgoth and later Sauron into an unnatural form. But that leads to a huge problem. Do goblins still have souls? They are demonstrated in the books as being able to think and to talk and to feel emotions and to reason. All of the things that separate humans from animals in traditional Christian thought. If that's the case, then it would not be okay to kill orcs under any circumstance. They are twisted and misguided, but in a way, they are ultimately God's children. The Lord of the Rings isn't really a setting where people are converting each other to Christianity per se, but under this logic, it would behoove Aragorn and Legolas and all of these other characters to spare the orcs and to grant them mercy at every opportunity, because they are people and people deserve mercy. And Tolkien realized if they weren't people, if they were actually mutated animals or something else, then there wouldn't be a reason to not go into the mountains and kill every single one of them. And no, Tolkien did not want his heroes doing this. To engage in endless bloodshed to result in the complete elimination of another culture, that is an evil thing to do. So because of this quandary, Tolkien agonized about the problem of orcs for the last 20 years of his life. There is a Wikipedia article about it if you want to see a quick overview. So going back to Georgie Porgy's quote, I think it's stupid because he is implying that these are questions that Tolkien did not think about, that Tolkien did not consider the moral implications of orcs, when it's truly the opposite. It's all he could ever think about. Metaphysical questions like these, such as the problem of orcs or whether Middle-earth was flat or round, prevented him from ever finishing the Silmarillion in his lifetime, because he didn't want to do a final draft until he really cracked these issues, but he was never able to. Perhaps George R.R. Martin, in making this anti-Tolkien proclamation, has cursed himself. Maybe he too has come across some logical problem that no matter how hard he writes, he simply cannot entangle. Will this man ever solve the Myronese knot? I don't think so! To wrap all of this up, you might have found my arguments in this last section to be very pedantic or very nitpicky. They probably were. But the reason why I was making those arguments is because those are the sorts of arguments you have to make in order to differentiate The Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire, two works that are ultimately way more similar than they are different. As I said earlier, under every dictionary definition of high versus low fantasy, primary world versus secondary world, sword and sorcery versus epic fantasy, immersive and portal quest fantasy versus intrusive fantasy, they are all ultimately in the same category of high fantasy, no matter how you dictate that. These more subjective definitions, such as idealism versus grittiness, are ultimately not useful because they are constructed on vibes and personal opinions. But if you can't get everyone to agree which books fall into which categories, then these terms fail as definitions. And so I do not like using the terms high versus low fantasy for any of them. Were you hoping a big definitive answer at the end? A smoking gun with a bullet? Unfortunately, I cannot provide an ultimate definition of low fantasy for you, at least not out of all of the potential definitions we have looked at throughout this video. But I will not let you walk away empty-handed, because in the process of researching and shooting this video, I have thought of a personal definition of low fantasy that I like the best, that is completely unrelated to all of the definitions that we have looked at so far. And I feel like that XKCD comic, where every attempt to form a universal standard just makes things even more complicated. But the reason why I thought of this definition is because it is going to be the most useful for me in terms of discussing books on this channel going forward. It will help me to communicate better. And my definition is low fantasy refers to works of magic or the supernatural that are not shelved in the fantasy section. So let me explain. If you read through classic literature, you find that many iconic works, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, Orlando by Virginia Woolf, all have supernatural or magic elements that might perhaps be called fantasy. These authors are not considered to be fantasy authors, and yet throughout their storied careers, they have written works of fantasy. And I want us to be able to discuss those books and those authors, both in terms of their place in the literary canon as well as in the realm of fantasy. If you look at my list of top 15 fantasy novels, you'll find that many of them, like Dictionary of the Khazars by Milorad Pavic or Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, are works that you will never find in a Barnes & Noble fantasy section. But I want to be able to talk about them as fantasy. Furthermore, I have started to notice that a lot of very influential works of fantasy, such as Lud in the Mist by Hope Merleys or Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner, no longer get placed in fantasy sections despite their influence on the genre. They are placed in the literature sections of modern bookstores, perhaps because they don't think that the modern fantasy crowd would enjoy them, and I think that is a real shame. And as you might have guessed by now, magical realism in all of its multivalent forms all fall under low fantasy, because you won't find any of those authors in the fantasy section. A quick sidebar about magical realism, because I learned to my dismay throughout this week that people on Booktube are uniquely terrible at defining what magical realism is. So I have polished a definition that I hope will make it a lot more clear to people. Magical realism refers to literary fiction that includes magical happenings, but said magical happenings are not acknowledged as supernatural within the cultural context that the book is written in, such as the Colombian milieu of 100 Years of Solitude. Since the magic is informed by the folklore and national histories of these cultural contexts, they permit the author to add multiple dimensions of symbolism and thematic depth that might not have been otherwise available. By including these thematically rich magical elements in literary fiction, the author is able to create a world that feels far more realistic to the lived subjectivities of daily life than cold rationalism affords. Magical realism was popularized to describe the works of mid-20th century Latin American authors such as Juan Rulfo, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Isabel Allende. But in the years since, the usage has spread to describe a wide variety of diverse and international authors, such as Salman Rushdie, Haruki Murakami, Olga Tokarczuk, and Toni Morrison. There is an ongoing debate about usage of the term magical realism, about whether it is being used to segregate non-white authors from mainstream fantasy sections. We are not going to litigate that today, but as long as those books are being shelved in the literature section, I am going to call them low fantasy. The reason why I went out of my way to provide you, the viewer, with my working definition of magical realism, I have found that magical realism is one of those terms that goes even more poorly defined on Booktube than even low fantasy. fantasy, even though out of all literary genres, it is one of the few that is most widely and academically defined. Like, you can pick up a dictionary and find a definition for magical realism. As of late, I have seen a lot of people use that term, magical realism, specifically to describe their Naruto-styled anime battle systems. As you can imagine, as someone who likes words to mean things, this really bothered me. I asked some of these authors, and they pointed me towards a 2019 listicle from Readsy.com entitled 50 Fantasy Subgenres You Should Know. Readsy is a site where indie authors can pay to have their books reviewed and posted on the front page for exposure. It honestly seems like a bit of a scam to me, but I do not know for sure. For a while, they really went hard on the SEO listicle game, hoping to drive Google traffic towards their website. The problem is, this listicle isn't good in the slightest. I feel really bad for the uncredited intern who they had compile this list. A lot of the provided definitions are incorrect, or if they are correct, the example works that are given will have absolutely nothing to do with the definition as provided. And to hit the SEO relevant number of 50, they kind of had to make up a lot of subgenres that aren't really considered a thing, like assassin fantasy or dragon fantasy. Sure, there's a lot of fantasy with assassins and dragons in it, but you're never going to find an assassin fantasy section in a bookstore. And if you couldn't guess, even though they correctly say that The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende is a prime work of magical realism, the actual definition that they give is completely wrong. Here's what they said. If you like your fantasy, well, realistic, magical realism is for you. It involves magic being carefully integrated into modern society, and it's great because there are no get-out-of-jail-free cards. All magic has to follow certain rules, and there's no Deus Ex Machina or Deus Ex Magica to conveniently swoop heroes out of trouble. The protagonists can use magic, yes, but they also have to use their heads in order to win the day. Why didn't the heroine of Beloved escape supernatural generational trauma for slavery by just using her magic systems? On August 9th, 2019, the Readsy YouTube channel posted a video version of their list, entitled A Guide to Fantasy Subgenres. In that video, a woman, who may or may not be the person who wrote the original listicle, goes over a handful of these subgenres before linking to the original listicle. What's interesting is that on September 10th, 2019, 32 days after Readsy posted their fantasy subgenre explainer video, Daniel Green, the man with more subscribers than the rest of Fantasy Booktube combined, posted his own video entitled Fantasy Subgenres Explained. In that video, he talks a big game about doing a lot of research and then reports a lengthy list of fantasy subgenres. Interestingly enough, 95% of the subgenres he lists correlates with the subgenres that Readsy provided in their original listicle. Both lists are in alphabetical order, so it becomes really apparent when you compare them side by side. This becomes even more apparent when he makes gross, blatant errors about what these different subgenres entail, which just happen to be the same gross, blatant errors that the Readsy listicle entailed. For example,
magic realism fantasy is when your magic has severe limits or consequences for being used. Basically, Mistborn or almost any magic system Brandon Sanderson comes up with.
So here's the thing. I am not calling Daniel Green a plagiarist. Danny Boy is famously litigious after all. But I think hypothetically, someone like a neutral outsider could look at that listicle and watch his video and say, wow, he shamelessly fucking copied someone's work and passed it off as his own. And why should he care? He can get away with it. He has proven that he can get away with anything. Just because you have a stupid fucking whiteboard behind you does not mean you're an expert on anything. In fact, it just allows you to bullshit more easily and people will uncritically gobble it up. I went out of my way to avoid naming and shaming most of these fantasy explainer sub videos that I have been talking about as a whole throughout the video. After all, I don't think it's wrong to try to offer some sort of explanation for what low fantasy means and then end up providing an answer that's not entirely cogent. cogent, because no definition for low fantasy is entirely cogent. However, when old Danny Boy does it, it has a uniquely wide impact and harm, because he positions himself as an expert, and the people who watch his videos treat him as an expert. His fantasy subgenre explainer has triple the views of any other explainer. And so whenever I come across wide misinformation about the fantasy subgenre, he will inevitably be the ground zero. He will be the original person who, I don't know, made something up or maybe took it from someone else. I will say it's entirely possible that Daniel Green did not copy that Reedsy listicle. Perhaps both of them derived their information from a third source, but I do not know for sure because neither of them listed any sources. And that is going to be the final takeaway for the video. Don't believe people just because they are speaking from an air of authority, myself included. When someone is making assertions, question those assertions, especially if they sound like bullshit, because they probably are. No one will ever take fantasy seriously if we maintain this culture of claiming to be an expert just because you read a Wikipedia article in maybe the first 3 pages of a Google search. And now everything is only getting worse through the proliferation of the plagiarism machine called ChatGPT. AI will frequently make up information and even make up sources if it is giving you what it thinks you want to hear. Try asking an AI what low fantasy is and witness for yourself the absolutely incoherent results that it gives you. Only by demanding integrity and academic honesty from the creators we follow will we ever dig ourselves out of the pit of AI slop. Thank you.